Cécile Marchand signed the last page of the memorial book at 10:17 in the morning. The pen was the one the cemetery kept on the table beside the book, a standard ballpoint, the kind that has been used for this purpose so many times that it has become the right instrument for it without anyone deciding that it should be. She signed her name the way she had signed her name for 38 years in the East Baton Rouge Parish Courthouse, legibly, completely, with the specific deliberateness of a woman who understood that a signature was a legal act, and treated it accordingly even when the document was a condolence book at a graveside. She set the pen down. She shook the last hand. She turned and walked toward the gate. The October sun was doing what Louisiana sun did in October, not the full assault of summer, but still present, still warm, the light on the oak trees, along the cemetery path, going gold the way Louisiana light went gold in the morning. She had been in this cemetery before for other funerals, for the visits she and Renaud had made each year on All Saints' Day in the Louisiana tradition, placing flowers and candles at the graves of the people who had preceded them. She had not thought on any of those visits about what it would feel like to walk out of this gate the way she was walking out now. Her phone buzzed, then buzzed again 4 seconds later. She stopped at the gate. She looked at the screen. 2 notifications. Same bank, 4 seconds apart. Account number X, 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 4471. Temporarily restricted pending confirmation of estate status. Account number X, 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 8832. Temporarily restricted pending confirmation of estate status. She stood at the gate of St. Joseph's Cemetery in her black dress in the October morning and looked at her phone and did not move. Solange Tran was beside her, had driven her from the house that morning, had been beside her through the service and the graveside and the handshaking, and now was at the gate and looked at Cécile's face, and then at the phone and said, "Cécile, what is it?" Cécile looked at her watch. 10:23. The service had ended at 10:17. She had been standing at the gate for 6 minutes. The request had been filed. She understood this immediately with the specific understanding of a woman who had spent 38 years watching legal proceedings move through the East Baton Rouge Parish court system and knew the timing of things. The requests had been filed while she was still at the graveside, not while she was driving home, not while she was changing out of her black dress, while she was standing at Renaud's grave. She looked at the 2 notifications. She thought about the Fong Bi now in the kitchen drawer. She had found it the week Renaud was admitted, had been looking for the spare key to the back door, and had found it under the keyring, a small brown envelope with Renaud's handwriting on the front. She had read the name. She had read the phone number. She had put it in her coat pocket and had not called because she had believed, with the specific belief of a person who is not ready to believe otherwise, that he would come home. He had not come home. She knew now that this was the moment he had written the envelope for. She scrolled to the number in her contacts. She had put it in her phone the day she found the envelope, which was something she had done without examining why she was doing it. 38 years of working in a courthouse had made certain habits automatic. You recorded things when you found them because recording things was how they existed when you needed them later. She pressed call. 1 ring, 2 rings. Octavia Fontaine said "Bas Marchand." Not a question, a confirmation. The voice of a woman who has been waiting for a specific call for 13 years and has recognized from the name on her screen that the call has arrived. Cécile said "Bas Fontaine." They just froze all my accounts. 3 seconds of silence. Not the silence of surprise. The silence of a woman receiving information she anticipated and is now moving from anticipation to action. Octavia said, "Where are you?" Cécile said, "The gate of St. Joseph's Cemetery." Octavia said, "Don't go anywhere. I'll be there in 20 minutes. A pause. She said, "Bas Marchand. Renaud told me in 2011, if you ever call me, it means the day has come. He prepared for this day 13 years ago." Cécile stood at the gate of St. Joseph's Cemetery with her phone in her hand and the 2 frozen account notifications on the screen and the October light on the oak trees and the sound of the remaining mourners behind her, and she thought about Renaud in 2011 sitting in a lawyer's office signing something leaving an envelope in a kitchen drawer under a keyring, trusting that she would find it at the right time. He had known she would find it at the right time. She had. She put the phone in her pocket. She looked at Solange.
"She said we wait here. Someone is coming."
Solange looked at her, at the black dress, the phone, the expression on Cecile's face, which was not the expression of a woman in crisis, but the expression of a woman who has just understood something and is orienting herself to what it means. She said, "What's happening?" Cecile said, "Renaud left me something in 2011 that I didn't know about. I think it answers the question of what's happening right now." She stood at the gate in the October morning and waited for Octavia Fontaine, who had been waiting 13 years for this call, and thought about her husband who had known her well enough to know that she would not be frightened by this, would be steady, would call the right number, would stand at the cemetery gate in the October light and wait for the thing he had prepared to arrive. He had been right about that. He had been right about most things. The funeral for Renaud Marchand ended at 10:17 on a Friday morning. The priest said the final words. The family placed the last flowers. The mourners dispersed in the way mourners disperse in Louisiana, slowly, with the particular unhurriedness of a culture that understands grief as something to be inhabited rather than processed, that makes room for the standing and the talking and the remembering that needs to happen before anyone goes back to the ordinary world. Cecile moved through it with the composure she had developed over 38 years of sitting in courtrooms where difficult things happened, and being the person in the room whose steadiness the proceedings depended on. She received the condolences. She said the right things. She shook the hands and accepted the embraces and allowed herself to be led to the memorial book, where she signed her name one final time. Her full name, the signature she had been putting on legal documents since 1986, legible and complete. She set the pen down. She shook the last hand. She walked toward the gate. Gilles Marchand had come to the house 3 weeks before the funeral, the day Renaud was transferred to the ICU. Cecile had opened the door, and he had embraced her with the warmth of a stepson who appeared at family occasions and called on birthdays and had maintained over the 22 years since Renaud had married her the specific cordial distance of a man who accepted his father's second marriage without fully welcoming it. She had understood this about Gilles from the beginning and had not required anything different. He had come inside. He had expressed his concern. He had asked about the doctors, about the prognosis, about whether she was eating. Then he had asked if he could look at some papers in a Renaud's office business continuity documents. He said for Marchand Holdings to ensure the company could keep operating during the transition period. Cecile had looked at him from the doorway of the office. She had said, "Thank you, Gilles." She had not moved from the doorway. She had not invited him further in. He had spent 40 minutes in that office. She had stood in the kitchen and made coffee and listened to the sound of drawers opening and closing with the specific attention she had developed over 38 years of listening to courtrooms, the particular attention that does not announce itself, that simply registers everything and files it. She had not known in that moment exactly what he was looking for. She had known he was looking for something. 8. Preston Delacroix had been practicing law in Shreveport for 26 years. He was methodical and thorough and had done exactly what Gilles had hired him to do, had reviewed the estate, had identified the legal pressure points, had prepared the account freeze request with the specific technical precision of a competent attorney executing a client's instructions. The instructions had been wait for the right moment. The right moment, as Gilles had defined it, was after the funeral, after the public ceremony of grief had been observed, after the moment in which even the most strategic person would have found it difficult to explain why they were moving against a widow before she had left the graveside. After, not during. Preston had filed at 10:21. The funeral had ended at 10:17. 4 minutes. The timestamp on the first notification read 10:21:43. The timestamp on the second read 10:21:47. 4 seconds between them, 4 minutes after the service ended, 6 minutes before Cecile reached the gate. She stopped at the gate when the notifications came. She was 69 years old and had spent 38 years in the East Baton Rouge Parish Courthouse and had witnessed from the clerk's table the full range of what human beings did to each other in the administration of estates and the distribution of assets and the aftermath of death. She had watched families fracture over objects worth less than the legal fees to dispute them. She had watched people move with extraordinary speed in the days after a loss, not from grief, but from calculation. She was not surprised. She was very still. Solange was beside her. Solange had been her colleague for 11 years at the courthouse before Cécile retired and had driven her that morning and was now standing at the gate looking at Cécile's face with the expression of a woman trying to understand what she was seeing. She said, "Cécile, do you need to call a lawyer?" Cécile looked at the notifications. $0 accessible. Both accounts. Same morning. Black dress still on. She looked at Solange. She said, "I already have a lawyer. I just haven't called her yet." She opened her bag. The envelope was in the interior pocket where she had put it the morning after she found it. The small brown envelope, Renaud's handwriting, the name and number she had entered into her phone, and then not called because she had believed he would come home. She had been wrong about that. She had been right about putting the number in her phone. She remembered the evening she found it. Renaud had been in the hospital 4 days. She had been moving through the house in the specific way of people who manage grief by managing tasks, cleaning things, straightening things, finding small purposes for her hands while her mind worked through what the doctors had told her. She had been looking for the spare key to the back door, which she had misplaced, and had found it in the kitchen drawer under the extra keyring. And under the keyring, the envelope. Cécile Neokoshuyan, G. Goi, Octavia Fontaine. Hai, Numbon, Bon, Tam, Be, Ba, Mots. Nothing else. No explanation. No instruction beyond the instruction. She had stood at the kitchen counter and held the envelope and thought about the specific care with which Renaud had placed it. Not in the desk drawer, not in the filing cabinet, not in the safe. In the kitchen drawer, under the keyring, the place she opened every morning for the car keys, the place she had opened 10,000 times in 22 years of living in this house. He had known she would find it. He had put it where she would find it without looking for it. She had folded it and put it in her coat pocket and entered the number into her phone and told herself she would call if she needed to, and she had not called because she had still believed with the specific sustaining belief of a woman who was not ready to stop believing that he would come home and explain it himself. She was standing at the gate of St. Joseph Cemetery in her black dress with $0 accessible in 2 accounts that had been frozen 6 minutes after Renaud's funeral ended. She understood now what the envelope was for. She pressed call. In her first year at the courthouse, the judge she had worked for had looked up from a case file one afternoon and said, "Cécile, in Louisiana law, the time and place of recordation is everything. Whoever records correctly in the right place at the right time, that person wins even before the court convenes." She had remembered that sentence for 38 years. Renaud had known she remembered it. She pressed call and listened to the phone ring and thought about Renaud in 2011, sitting in a lawyer's office, signing something asking Octavia Fontaine to keep the document in her vault, leaving an envelope in a kitchen drawer, and understood for the first time that he had been thinking about that sentence too. He had recorded correctly, in the right place. In 2011, the phone rang twice. Octavia Fontaine said "Bas Marchand." Not a question. Solange drove without asking where to go. Cécile had said Government Street and Solange had turned onto St. Ferdinand without comment, which was one of the things Cécile had valued about their 11 years working together at the courthouse. Solange understood the difference between the questions that needed to be asked and the ones that didn't, and she did not ask the ones that didn't. The drive was 18 minutes. Cécile sat in the passenger seat with the brown envelope in both hands and looked at it the way she had looked at it the evening she found it, with the specific attention of a woman who has spent 38 years handling documents and understands that what a document contains is only part of what it is. The other part is the intention behind it, the decision to create it, the decision about where to put it and when it would be found. Renaud had put this envelope in the kitchen drawer. Under the keyring. in the place she opened every morning. She had found it the week he went into the ICU and had not called because she had believed he would come home and explain it himself. She understood now that this had been part of his calculation too, that he had not expected her to call immediately, had trusted her judgment about when the call was necessary. He had given her the envelope and trusted her to know. She had known. It had taken a Friday morning at a cemetery gate. Octavia Fontaine was standing at the door of her office when Solange pulled up. She was 64 years old and had the specific quality of a woman who has been waiting for something and is not surprised when it arrives. She had come to the door before the car stopped, which meant she had been watching for it, which meant she had been ready since the phone call from the cemetery gate. She came down the steps and opened Cécile's door. She said, "Bas Marchand, come inside." Her office was on the second floor, the kind of office that accumulates its character through decades of use, rather than through design, with the bookshelves that had been filled gradually and the desk that bore the marks of 30 years of serious work. She led Cécile to the chair across from the desk and sat down herself and reached to the left side of the desk where a document file was already placed. She set it on the desk between them. The cover was handwritten Octavia's own hand, the specific careful script of a notary public who understood that the external identification of a document was part of its legal integrity. Marchand d'Action en paiement, November 14th, 2011. Confidential. She looked at Cécile. She said, "I have kept this for 13 years at Renault's request. You called, it's time." Cécile looked at the document file. She looked at the date on the cover. She said 2011. He did this in 2011? Octavia said November 14th, 2011. Renault came to my office alone. No assistant, no family member, no one. He sat where you're sitting now, and he said she paused in the way of a PE. Octavia opened the document. She placed it flat on the desk between them and turned it so Cécile could read it without having to reach for it, the specific consideration of a woman who has presented documents to people in difficult circumstances before and understands that the manner of presentation is part of the work. The first page, Dachon and payment transfer of ownership interest. Renault Eugène Marchand transféreur. Cécile Marchand et Thibaudot transféré. 67% ownership interest in Marchand Holdings, LLC, a Louisiana limited liability company organized and existing under the laws of the state of Louisiana. Recorded East Baton Rouge Parish Clerk of Court, November 14, 2011. Cécile read it the way she had read legal documents for 38 years, completely from the first word, without skipping, allowing each line to say what it said. She read the property description. She read the transfer language. She read the consideration clause, love and affection, which was the language Louisiana civil law permitted for inter vivos transfers between spouses, the language that made the transfer a gift rather than a sale, and removed it entirely from the calculus of estate distribution. She turned to the last page. 2 signatures. The first, Renault E. Marchand. The handwriting she had been reading for 22 years, the specific upright script of a man who had been taught penmanship by the nuns at St. Augustine and had never entirely departed from it, the signature she had seen on 30 years of business documents and Christmas cards, and the note he had left on the kitchen counter the morning she retired from the courthouse that said 38 years. You outlasted 3 chief judges and 2 governors. Come home and let me make you coffee. The second, Octavia M. Fontaine, Notary, Public. The Louisiana Notary seal pressed in red at the lower corner, its impression clear and permanent in the way of things designed to be permanent. Cécile looked at the 2 signatures. She said this is the second signature no one knew about. Octavia said they looked in the succession records. That's where a will would be. That's where an attorney challenging an estate looks first and second and third. Dachon en paiement doesn't live there. It lives in the land records and the business records of East Baton Rouge Parish. You have to know it exists to know where to look for it. She said Gilles didn't know it existed. Cécile set the document down. She said, "Explain it to me as if I need it explained." Octavia looked at her. A brief look, the look of a woman who knew that Cécile Marchand did not need it. explained who understood that the request was not about ignorance, but about wanting to hear it spoken aloud in this room on this morning for the record that existed in her own mind. She said dations en paiement is a mechanism of Louisiana civil law. It doesn't exist in 49 other states. It derives from the French Civil Code. Louisiana's legal system is the only one in the country built on that foundation rather than English common law. Under Article 2655 of the Louisiana Civil Code, a person can transfer ownership of property to another person as satisfaction of an obligation. In this case, the obligation Renaud described as the debt of love and partnership accumulated over their marriage. She said the transfer is complete at execution and recording, not at death, not through probate, not as a bequest that can be contested by heirs, because it is not a bequest, it is a completed property transaction that occurred in 2011. Renaud did not leave Cécile a portion of Marchand Holdings in his will. He transferred it to her 13 years ago. By the time he died, he didn't own 67% of Marchand Holdings. She did. She said an heir can contest a will. An heir cannot contest a transaction that was completed before the testator died, recorded in the public record, and has been legally effective for 13 years. Cécile nodded. She had known this. She had sat through enough property disputes at the courthouse to know this. What made her pause was not the legal mechanism, it was the choice of it. The specific, deliberate choice of a man who had grown up in a family of Louisiana lawyers, who had understood from childhood that the right instrument in the right jurisdiction made the difference, who had sat in Octavia's office in November of 2011 and chosen the one tool that would do exactly what he needed it to do. She said he knew Louisiana law well enough to choose this. Octavia said, "His grandfather was an attorney. His father was an attorney. He told me that day, he said, I grew up hearing my grandfather say that property is protected not by intention, but by paperwork. Intention disappears with the person who holds it. Paperwork stays." She reached to the last page of the document. She said Renaud wrote the final clause himself. I drafted the instrument, but he wrote this section by hand and asked me to incorporate it verbatim. She read it aloud in the measured voice she used for legal language, the voice that did not editorialize, that allowed the words to carry their own weight. Transferee Cécile Anne Marchand hereby accepts full ownership of said interest effective upon execution of this instrument and recording thereof, said transfer irrevocable and not subject to challenge by heirs, descendants, or successors of the transferor. She set the document down. She said he wrote that clause himself. He knew what he was saying. He had thought about exactly who might challenge it and exactly what language would foreclose that challenge. The office was quiet. Cécile looked at the document, at the two signatures on the last page, at the Louisiana notary seal, pressed in red, permanent and official, the seal that had been pressed there on a November afternoon, 13 years ago, when Renaud had sat in this chair and signed his name and asked Octavia to keep it in her vault and tell no one. She placed her index finger on Renaud's signature. She did not say anything. She did not need to say anything. She thought about a dinner table early in their marriage, Renaud telling her about his grandfather, the lawyer, the lesson that had been given to him young and that he had apparently never forgotten. Property is not protected by intention. It is protected by paperwork. Intention disappears with the person who holds it. Paperwork stays. She had said he was right. Renaud had looked at her across the table and said, I know. He had been 30-something then. He had been thinking even then about the paperwork. She looked at the recording date, November 14, 2011. She said, when can we meet with Gilles and his attorney? Octavia said I called Preston Delacroix's office this morning after your call from the cemetery. They're available tomorrow. I told them we had a document relevant to the account freeze that they needed to see in person. She said I didn't tell them what it was. Cécile looked up from the document. Octavia said Renaud also said when he left the envelope instructions, he said, Octavia, when the time comes, don't describe the document in advance. Let them read it in the room. That's how it will have the most effect. She said he thought about that too. Cécile said, of course he did. She picked up the dation en paiement and held it in both hands, 8 pages, 2 signatures, a Louisiana notary seal, and 13 years of waiting in a vault on Government Street for the morning that had now arrived. She thought about Renaud coming home late on a Wednesday in November 2011, sitting down to dinner quieter than usual. She had asked if something was wrong. He had said nothing was wrong. He had looked at her across the table and said, "Cecile, I want you to know that Marchand Holdings will be fine, whatever happens." She had thought he meant the business. He had meant her. Preston Delacroix's office was on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Shreveport that had the particular quality of spaces designed to communicate institutional seriousness, the kind of office where the furniture and the view were intended to tell you before anyone spoke that the people who worked here were accustomed to winning. Gilles had chosen it deliberately. The meeting was at 2 o'clock. Gilles arrived first with Thierry behind him. Thierry, who had not signed the account freeze request, had not been consulted about it, and had driven from Baton Rouge that morning without explaining to anyone why he had decided to come. He sat in the chair against the wall, slightly apart from the table, the chair of a man who has come to witness rather than to participate. Preston was already at the table with his files. Octavia and Cecile arrived together on time, which was the way Cecile had arrived at every legal proceeding of her career, not early enough to seem anxious, not late enough to seem disrespectful. Octavia carried her briefcase. She set it beside her chair when she sat down. She did not open it. Preston presented the case for 12 minutes. He was methodical and thorough, and had the specific credibility of a man who believed what he was saying, which was, Cecile understood because Gilles had given him an incomplete picture, which was not the same as a false one. Preston had been told about the 2009 will. He had been told about the succession filing. He had been told about the account freeze as a protective measure while probate was being processed. He had not been told about November 14, 2011. He laid out the argument cleanly. The 2009 will named Renaud's sons as the beneficiaries of his business interests. Cecile was not named in the business succession documents. The account freeze was a standard protective measure in contested estate proceedings designed to preserve assets while the courts determined the proper distribution. He said the position of the Marchand family is that the estate has not been properly administered and that Mrs. Cecile Marchand has been operating under an assumption of ownership that is not supported by the testamentary documents. He closed his folder. He looked across the table at Octavia. He said, "Does the respondent have a position to present?" Octavia said yes. She opened her briefcase. She did not make a speech. She had been a notary public for 31 years and had sat in rooms like this one many times and had learned that the most effective thing she could do with a document was place it in front of the people who needed to read it and allow them to read it. She removed the dation en paiement from her briefcase. She placed it on the table in the center where it could be reached from either side. She said, "This is a dation en paiement executed on November 14, 2011, recorded at the East Baton Rouge Parish Clerk of Court, recording number 2011-47821. It transfers the entirety of Renaud Marchand's 67% ownership interest in Marchand Holdings, LLC, to Cecile Anne Marchand. Not through probate, not through the will, effective from the date of execution, which is to say from 13 years ago." She placed her hands flat on the table and sat back. Preston looked at the document. He picked it up. The room was quiet while he read. Cecile watched him read with the specific attention she had developed over 38 years of watching people read legal documents in rooms where outcomes depended on what the documents said. She watched his eyes move down the first page, the identification of the parties, the description of the asset, the transfer language. She watched him find the consideration clause. She watched him find the recording date, November 14, 2011. She saw him register it. He turned to the second page. He read the irrevocability clause, the clause Renaud had written himself in his own language, the language of a man who had grown up in a family of Louisiana lawyers and understood that the right words, in the right document, in the right jurisdiction, were more durable than any argument anyone could make against them. Said transfer irrevocable and not subject to challenge by heirs, descendants, or successors of the transferor. He turned to the last page. 2 signatures. Renaud Desmarchand, Octavia M. Fontaine, Notary Public. The Louisiana notary seal in red at the lower corner, its impression clean and permanent. Preston set the document on the table. He placed his hand flat on it. He did not pick it up again.
5 seconds.
The room held those 5 seconds the way rooms hold certain silences, not emptily, but with the specific weight of a space in which something has been understood, and the understanding has not yet been spoken. Then Preston looked at Gilles. He said, "Gilles, I need to speak with you privately." Gilles looked at Preston. He looked at the document on the table. He looked at Octavia. He looked at Cécile for the first time since he had walked into the room, a direct look, the look of a man who has just received information that has rearranged his understanding of a situation he believed he understood completely. He said 2011. Not a question, not an accusation, just the year spoken aloud the way you speak a fact when you have just understood what it means. 13 years before his father died. 8 years before Gilles became CEO. 4 years before anyone had reason to believe that Marchand Holdings would become what it had become. 2011. At the table against the wall, Thierry stood. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He walked to Octavia's side of the table. He extended his hand.
She shook it.
He did not look at Gilles. He did not look at Preston. He did not say anything. He walked to the door and opened it and left. The door closed quietly behind him. The room was left with Gilles and Preston on one side, Octavia and Cécile on the other, and the dation en paiement in the center of the table with Preston's hand still resting on it. 8 pages, 2 signatures, a red notary seal, and a recording date that made every argument Preston had just spent 12 minutes constructing into an argument about something that had not been true for 13 years. Cécile sat with her hands folded. She was thinking about a courtroom in 1987, her first year at the courthouse, a property dispute that had gone to the family that had recorded their document 15 years earlier and had the original in their possession. The judge had said the winner is not the person with the best will. The winner is the person who recorded correctly in the right place and has the original. She had remembered that lesson for 38 years. Renaud had known she remembered it. In November of 2011, he had done exactly what the judge described. Preston looked at Gilles. He said, "We should talk privately before this goes any further." Preston and Gilles were in the side room for 11 minutes. Octavia poured water from the carafe on the conference table, 2 glasses, one for herself and one for Cécile, and set them down and sat back in her chair. The room had the specific quality of a space from which the argument has been removed, leaving only the facts and the 2 people who already understood what the facts meant. They did not speak. There was nothing to say that had not already been said by the document on the table. Cécile looked at the dation en paiement. It was still where Preston had set it in the center of the table, his hand no longer on it, 8 pages lying flat and ordinary, in the way that documents are ordinary, when they are not being contested, when they are simply what they are, a record of something that happened correctly, executed correctly, filed correctly, preserved for the moment it was needed. She thought about November 14th, 2011. She thought about Renaud coming home that evening and sitting down to dinner and being quieter than usual. She had asked him once gently if something was wrong at work. He had said nothing was wrong. He had looked at her across the table with the expression she now understood as the expression of a man who has done something important and cannot explain it yet, and is sitting with the knowledge of it in the particular privacy of a person who loves someone enough to protect them from the weight of what the love has required. She had not known. She had thought he was thinking about the business. The door of the side room opened at 11 minutes past 2. Preston came out first. Gilles followed. Preston was carrying a single page, a document he had clearly drafted in the side room or had prepared in advance in the event that the meeting produced the outcome he now understood it had produced. He set it on the conference table. He said, "I'll explain the basis for the withdrawal." He set it to the room generally in the specific register of an attorney, transitioning from advocacy to administration. The tone of a man who has recognized that the advocacy phase of the proceeding is finished and is now managing the logistics of what comes next. He said first, "The datation en paiement of November 2011 is a validly recorded instrument under Louisiana Civil Code, Article 26555. It was executed while Renaud Marchand was in full legal capacity, witnessed by an independent notary, and recorded in the East Baton Rouge Parish Public Record. There is no procedural or substantive basis to challenge it." He said second, "The 67% ownership interest in Marchand Holdings that was the subject of the account freeze was not part of Renaud Marchand's estate at the time of his death because it had been transferred from his ownership 13 years prior. The account freeze was predicated on the existence of disputed estate assets. That predicate does not exist." He said third, "Continuation of the freeze in the absence of a valid legal basis would expose the requesting parties to liability for damages resulting from the improper restriction of Mrs. Marchand's accounts." He placed the withdrawal document in front of Gilles. He said this rescinds the freeze request and authorizes the bank to restore full access to both accounts. Gilles looked at the document. He did not look at Octavia. He did not look at Cécile. He looked at the document the way a man looks at something he needs to accept, and is in the process of accepting, not quickly, not with visible emotion, with the specific stillness of someone who has been in a room with a lawyer for 11 minutes and has received a clear account of the position he is in and has made a decision about what to do with it. He picked up the pen. He signed. He set the pen down. He looked at Octavia. He said, "Ba Fontaine. What did my father say when he signed the document in 2011? Octavia looked at him for a moment, the look of a woman deciding how much of a confidence she is permitted to share, and concluding that this particular confidence was meant to be shared eventually with exactly this person. He said, "Octavia, Gilles is a good son. But Cécile is the one who stays every day. I need to make sure that our home, in every sense of the word, belongs to the person who stays." Gilles said nothing. He looked at the datation en paiement on the table, at his father's signature on the last page, at the date. 2011? He had been 37 years old in 2011. He had been living in Shreveport. He had been building his career, managing his own life, visiting Baton Rouge for the holidays and the important occasions and the calls that fell on the right days. He had heard his grandfather's lesson from his father's mouth at a dinner table when he was a boy. The winner is not the person who argues loudest. The winner is the person who places the paperwork in the right place before the room convenes. He had heard the lesson. He had not known his father had applied it. Not to him, to Cécile. Preston called the bank. He made the call from the conference room on speaker with the specific efficiency of a man executing the administrative consequence of a decision that had already been made. He provided the account numbers. He confirmed the withdrawal of the freeze request. He was told that both accounts, Jacques Fresh XXX 71 and Yurge XSSXH8832, would be restored to full access before 5 o'clock. He ended the call. Octavia stood. She shook Preston's hand, the handshake of two attorneys who have been on opposite sides of a proceeding that has concluded, which carries its own specific formality, the mutual acknowledgement that the work was done correctly and the outcome was what the documents required. She shook Gilles' hand. Gilles accepted it. He did not speak. Cécile stood. She walked toward the door. She passed Gilles. She did not extend her hand. Not from anger, she was not angry, had not been angry, had moved through this day in the specific register of a woman who had been a court clerk for 38 years and had understood from the first notification at the cemetery gate that this was a legal problem and not a personal one, and that legal problems were resolved by documents and not by the emotions of the people who held them. She nodded. A small nod. The nod of a woman acknowledging a fact that Gilles was there, that the proceeding had ended, that what came next would be what it was. She walked out. Octavia followed briefcase in hand, the dation en paiement, and the withdrawal document together inside it, two documents 13 years apart that had together resolved in one afternoon what a longer conflict might have taken years to settle. The elevator opened. They stepped in. Octavia said, "Your accounts will be accessible by 5. Cecile said, "I know." The doors closed. Outside the 14th floor windows, Shreveport was doing what it did on a Friday afternoon in October, going about its ordinary business entirely unaware that in a conference room, one floor above the street, a document signed by a man 13 years before his death had just done exactly what he had signed it to do. Shin loi, toi jun nham. Beat 6. Phi Viet Bang Tiang Anhatakiyo Sano Tat Kakas Beats Trok Jatoy Viet Lange. They left Preston Delacroix's office at 3:47 in the afternoon. Octavia drove. Cecile sat in the passenger seat with her phone in her lap, not looking at it, just holding it the way you hold something that is waiting. The drive from Shreveport to Baton Rouge was 45 minutes, and Louisiana on a Friday afternoon in October was doing what Louisiana Friday afternoons in October did, the light going gold through the live oaks, the sky wide and flat in the way Louisiana sky was always flat, the sun finding its long angle before it went down. The car was quiet. Cecile did not want to talk. Octavia understood this, had understood it from the cemetery gate that morning, from the way Cecile had gotten into Solange's car with the brown envelope in her hands, and had not explained anything from the way she had sat in Octavia's office and placed both hands on the document file before opening it. This was not a woman who needed anyone to fill her silences. Octavia drove. Cecile watched her phone. No notification yet. They crossed the Mississippi Bridge at 4:20. She did not know what Gilles felt hearing that. She did not need to know. At 4:53, the phone buzzed. She looked down. First notification account, Binur X Chir SXX Chatsthor 471 has been restored to full access. 8 seconds later, second notification account, Thar XX Chu X Say Us 832 has been restored to full access. She looked at both notifications. This morning, 2 freeze notifications, timestamp 10:21:43 and 10:21:47, 4 seconds apart, while she was still in her black dress at the cemetery gate. This afternoon, 2 restoration notifications, timestamp 16:53:21 and 16:53:29, 8 seconds apart. While the car was moving on I-10 toward Baton Rouge in the Friday afternoon light. Same form, opposite direction. The circle closed before 5 o'clock, exactly as Preston had said. Octavia was driving eyes on the road. She did not ask. She knew from the quality of the silence in the car that what they had been waiting for had arrived. After a moment, she said, not looking at Cecile, in the even voice of someone recalling something held a long time and finding this the right moment to release it. Renaud said one more thing when he left my office in 2011. I kept it because I thought it was worth keeping. She adjusted her hands on the wheel. He said Octavia Cecile has been a court clerk for 38 years. She understands Louisiana law. I don't need to explain to her why a dation en paiement matters. I just need her to have the document in her hands at the right moment. She'll know what to do. The car moved through the October afternoon. Louisiana spread out on both sides of the highway, live oaks and marsh, and the long gold light finding every horizontal surface. Cecile looked out the window. She thought about November 2011. The evening Renaud had come home late, had sat down at the dinner table quieter than usual, and had looked across at her and said, "Cecile, I want you to know that Marchand Holdings will be fine, whatever happens." She had asked what he was worried about. He had said he wasn't worried, just wanted her to know. She had not asked further, had thought he was thinking about ordinary business concerns, a difficult contract, a complicated client. The ordinary anxieties a man brings home from running a company and sets down after dinner? She understood now.
Not a promise, a confirmation.
Everything had been done from that afternoon. From the moment he sat in Octavia's office and signed his name and looked at the notary and said, "She will know what to do," she had known. She had called the right number from the right gate on the right morning. He had known she would. That was why he had put the envelope in the kitchen drawer. Cecile looked at the phone in her lap. 2 restoration notifications, timestamp 4:53. She said quietly, not to Octavia, not to the road, not to the Louisiana afternoon moving past the window. Before 5 o'clock, Renault. A beat. He got it right. The car kept moving. Baton Rouge appeared ahead. The water tower, the low skyline, the city she had worked in for 38 years, and understood from the inside, in the way Renault had known she understood it when he sat in Octavia's office and signed a document, not for that day but for this one. The day she stood at a cemetery gate in her black dress with 2 freeze notifications and a phone number in her wallet, and knew exactly who to call. Cecile came home at 5:30. She came in through the back door, the habit of decades, the door she had always used because it opened directly into the kitchen, and the kitchen was where she began and ended every day. She set her bag on the counter. She took off her coat. She stood in the kitchen in the particular way you stand in a space that is yours and has been yours for long enough that standing in it is itself a form of returning. She opened the kitchen drawer. The brown envelope was not there. She had taken it with her that morning, had put it in her bag before leaving for the cemetery, had carried it to Octavia's office and then to Shreveport, and back, had held it in the car on the way home and placed it in her bag when they arrived in Baton Rouge. She had carried it all day. The drawer was empty where it had been. She looked at the empty space for a moment. She reached into her bag. She took the envelope out and set it on the counter. Renault's handwriting on the front. Cecile, if anything happens, call Octavia Fontaine, 225-448-7731. She stood at the kitchen counter and looked at it the way she had looked at legal documents for 38 years, completely allowing it to be what it was. A small brown envelope, standard size, the kind sold in packs at any office supply store. His handwriting, the specific upright script of a man taught penmanship by nuns at St. Augustine, the handwriting she had been reading for 22 years on grocery lists and birthday cards, and the note he left on the counter the morning she retired. She thought about how many mornings this envelope had been in that drawer. She had taken it out when she found it, read the name and the number, entered the number into her phone, put it back. She had opened that drawer every morning since, for the car keys, for the spare key to the back door, for the small items that accumulate in kitchen drawers over decades of living in a house. How many times had her hand moved past the envelope without her thinking about it? How many mornings had she stood in this kitchen and Renault had stood beside her and poured coffee and handed her a cup and said nothing about the envelope in the drawer because there was nothing to say yet? He had known there would be a morning when there was something to say. He had waited for that morning to say it in his own way, through a phone number on a small brown envelope, through a woman named Octavia Fontaine, who had kept a document in a vault for 13 years and answered the phone on the second ring. Her phone rang.
Solange.
She answered. Solange, said Cecile. I heard the accounts were reopened. Are you all right? Cecile said, I'm fine, Solange. I'm standing in the kitchen. Solange said, standing in the kitchen, doing what? Cecile looked at the envelope on the counter. She said, looking at a brown envelope Renault left in the drawer. A pause. Solange said, is it important? Cecile said it did what it needed to do. She said good night and set the phone down. She picked up the envelope. She held it for a moment, the specific lightness of a thing that has been emptied of its purpose, the phone number now in her phone, where it would stay, the task it had been left to accomplish, completed in a single Friday that had begun at a cemetery gate and ended here. She did not put it back in the drawer. She walked to the shelf above the counter, the shelf she and Renault had put up in the 3rd year in this house, the shelf where she kept the things that belonged in the kitchen but were not for cooking. The small frame photograph was there, Cecile and Renault at their 30th anniversary dinner, a restaurant in New Orleans, both of them dressed for an occasion, and both of them laughing at something outside the frame. She set the envelope beside the photograph, the empty envelope and the photograph of his face. Two things Renaud had left in the kitchen, one with a phone number, one with his smile. Both in the right place. Both doing what they were meant to do. She stepped back and looked at them. She said quietly, not to the room, not to the photograph exactly, but to the quality of presence that remained in a kitchen where someone had stood for 22 years and made coffee, and set the newspaper on the counter and known where the spare key was and placed an envelope in a drawer under a key ring. Renaud, you put this in the kitchen drawer, not the nightstand, not the study, the kitchen, where I open it every morning. Saturday morning came quietly. The light through the kitchen window was the particular light of Baton Rouge in October, not the full weight of the summer sun, but something softer, the light of a season that had finally decided to be gentle, coming in at the low angle that found the kitchen counter and the shelf and the photograph and the small brown envelope beside it. Cécile sat at the kitchen table with her coffee in both hands. She had slept. This surprised her slightly. She had not expected to sleep, had expected the day to follow her into the night, the way difficult days sometimes did, persisting in the mind past the point where the body needed to stop. But she had slept. She thought this was because the thing that had needed to be done had been done, and the specific vigilance that had been keeping her alert since the cemetery gate had recognized that it was no longer needed and had released her. She sat in the quiet kitchen and held her coffee and looked at the morning. Octavia called at 9:15. She said, "Mrs. Marchand, I want to ask about Marchand Holdings. Do you want to assume formal operational control, or would you prefer to delegate to a third party for now?" Cécile said, "I need time to think about that Bas Fontaine." Octavia said, "Of course, Renaud wasn't in a hurry either. He left you 13 years. You can take a little more time." Cécile said, "I'll call you by the end of the week." She set the phone down. She looked out the kitchen window. The backyard was the backyard of 22 years, the garden beds she had tended, the porch where they had sat on Sunday evenings, and at the back of the yard, near the fence, the live oak Renaud had planted on their 10th wedding anniversary. He had presented it to her as a tree no larger than a sapling, laughing when she asked what it was supposed to be. He had said an oak. She had said it's very small. He had said not yet. The tree was tall now. The Louisiana October had given it a faint gold at the edges of the leaves, not the dramatic turn of a northern autumn, but the subtle incremental shift of a southern tree, acknowledging the season's change. She had watched it grow for 22 years from this window, this table, this specific morning angle of light. She thought about what the judge had told her in her first year at the courthouse, that sentence she had carried for 38 years. Whoever records correctly in the right place at the right time wins, even before the court convenes. She had told Renaud that. She was not sure when. Some dinner, some evening, some ordinary conversation in which she had brought home something from work and set it on the table between them. She could not place the occasion. She only knew that she had said it and that he had been listening in the way he listened to things he intended to remember, not interrupting, not responding immediately, receiving it. She had not known he was filing it. She knew now. November 14, 2011. He had sat in Octavia's office and done exactly what the judge had described. Recorded correctly, in the right place, at the right time. 13 years before anyone needed it to have been done. She turned in her chair and looked at the shelf, the brown envelope beside the photograph. His face in the photograph, the anniversary dinner in New Orleans, both of them laughing at something outside the frame, the specific unguarded happiness of two people who have been together long enough to forget they are being photographed. The envelope was empty now. The phone number was in her phone where it would stay. The document the envelope had pointed her toward was in Octavia's vault, where it had been for 13 years, and where it would remain recorded permanently in the East Baton Rouge Parish Public Record, available to anyone who knew to look in the right place. She picked up her coffee cup. She said quietly to the kitchen, to the morning light, to the oak tree, outside the window, to the photograph on the shelf. 38 years you listened to me talk about Louisiana law, Renaud. A long pause. You were listening more carefully than I knew. She sat in the kitchen that had been hers since the first morning in this house when Renaud had brought 2 cups of coffee to this table and set one in front of her, and sat down across from her, and said, "You told me once that you loved Louisiana law because of its clarity. Record the right thing in the right place, and it stands. No one can argue with it." She had said, "That's right." He had said, "I like that about it too." She had not known then that he was not making conversation. She had not known that he was sitting across from her at the kitchen table, in the first weeks of their life in this house in the early morning light, coming through the kitchen window and filing away what she had said for the morning, 13 years later when he would sit in an attorney's office and apply it. He had heard her from the first morning. He had heard her and remembered and acted in the right place at the right time in the exact language she had spent 38 years learning. Not a promise, a document. Recorded in East Baton Rouge Parish on November 14, 2011. Still standing, still exactly where he had placed it. The coffee was warm in her hands. The oak tree was in the yard. The kitchen was hers. It had always been hers. Renaud had made sure of that in the language she understood best, the language of correct recordation, of the right instrument in the right jurisdiction of paperwork that outlasts the person who signs it and does its work long after they are gone. She had taught him that language. He had used it to love her.